Good day everyone. Today I will report about writing arguments. First, let's define argument. Argument, it is a reason given in proof and an act or process of arguing. Now, in argumentative writing, you should take a stand on debatable issue. Issues being debated might be a matter of public policy. Examples are: should be religious groups be allowed to meet on school property? And what is the least dangerous way to dispose of nucleus waste? Your goal in argumentative writing is to change the way your readers think about a subject or to convince them to take an action that they might not otherwise to take. Remember, do not assume that your audience agrees already with you. Instead, envision skeptical readers who will make up their minds after listening to both sides of the debate. To convince such readers, you will need to build arguments strong enough to stand up to the arguments put forward by your opponents, and sometimes called the opposition. In writing arguments, first you should plan a strategy. Should critically think about your topic. It is very important. Planning strategy for an argumentative essay is much like planning a debate for a speech class. In planning your strategy, start with listing your arguments. Example, your purpose is to argue in favor of lowering the legal drinking age from 21 to 18. Here is the example of listing your arguments. Society treats 18 years old as mature for most purposes. You can add some details to support your first sentence, like they can vote, they can go away to college. Another is, age is not necessarily an indication of maturity. After listing your arguments, next is listing the arguments of the opposition. Of course, you should be ready of arguments that your opponent will do to contradict with you. Here are some possible arguments against lowering the drinking age to 18. Example, teenage drinking leads to drunk driving, which in turn leads to many deaths. And teenage drinking sometimes leads to date rape and gang violence. If possible, you should talk to someone who disagrees with you and read some articles that are critical to your position. It will help you to be familiarized with the opposition's view, and you can be reasonably sure that you have not overlooked an important argument that might be used against you. Next is considering your audience. You should think realistically about the impact that the argument would likely to have on your intended audiences. Always remember that your audiences have their own perception and opinions that might not agree with yours. For example, your view about age is not necessarily an indication of maturity. This could not be acceptable to older audiences. While your opponent's view about teenage drinking leads to drunk driving, which in turn leads to many deaths, is very acceptable and had already proven by all the audiences. To have any hope of convincing your audience, you would need to take this argument very seriously. And lastly is rethinking about your position. After exploring your side and the opponent's side, you may decide to modify your initial position. Your first thoughts might be oversimplified, too extreme, or mistaken in some other respect. If you still have hope that you could persuade your audience with your argument, you could modify your position in light of your audiences. To have a better chance of convincing them, you could just argue that 18-year-olds should be allowed to drink beer and wine, not hard alcohol. After planning a strategy, you should frame a thesis and state your major arguments. Again, a thesis is a sentence that expresses the main point of an essay. In argumentative writing, thesis should clearly state that your position in the issue you have chosen to write about. Example issue, the high insurance rate that most companies set for the young male drivers. You should think carefully about your own views, the argument of the opponent, and your audience to come up with this example. Although young male drivers have a high accident rate, insurance companies should not be allowed to discriminate against anyone who has driven for the past 2 years without traffic violation. After framing your thesis, try to state your major arguments, preferably in sentence form. Your thesis and your argument will give you a rough outline of an essay. This is an example of rough outline by Julian L. Simon, a business professor at the University of Maryland. Simon argues for an easing of restriction on immigration into the United States. See that his thesis is in the economic terms, and his arguments are in economic reasons. After framing your thesis, you should draft an introduction that states your position without alienating readers. Your introduction should state your position on an issue in a clear thesis sentence, and it should do this without needlessly alienating the audience whom you hope to convince. Example introduction: a student argued against allowing prayer in public schools. During most of my school years, the Lord's Prayer was a part of our opening exercises. I never gave it a second thought, and I never heard anyone complain about it. So when prayer in the school became an issue in the courts, I was surprised to hear that anyone viewed it as a threat to individual rights or as a violation of the division between church and state. But now that I've thought about it, I would not like to see the practice of prayer in schools instituted. As we see, she established common grounds with readers who disagreed with her, and she ends it with a clear thesis that states her current position in the issue. Another example: although the Supreme Court has ruled against prayer in the public schools on First Amendment grounds, many people still feel that prayer should be allowed. These people, most of whom hold strong religious beliefs, are well-intentioned. What they fail to realize is that the Supreme Court decision, although it was made on legal grounds, makes good sense on religious grounds as well. Prayer is too important to be trusted. This example established common ground with readers who disagree with his position by showing that they share their common value, and because it takes into consideration the values of those who disagree with him, readers are likely to approach his essay with an open mind. After making your draft, you need to support each argument with specific evidence. When presenting your arguments for your position, you will need to back them up with evidence using facts, statistics, examples, illustrations, expert opinions, and so on, depending on the issue you have chosen to write about. Let's start with using facts and statistics. A fact is something that is known with certainty because it has been objectively verified. Example, the capital of Philippines is Manila. Another, carbon has an atomic weight of 12. While statistics are a collection of numerical facts. Example, 1/2 of the U.S. households currently own a VCR. Most arguments are supported by at least one extent by facts and statistics. Example, Karen Shaw wrote the MLA research essay on AIDS and language. Using gathered facts and statistics, she included them in her essay. The gorilla Coco has mastered nearly 200 signs as measured by Gardner's criterion, by Patterson and Linden, pages 83 to 84. This example contains a fact and a statistic. Next is using examples and anecdotes. Example and anecdotes alone are really prove a point, but when used in combination with other forms of evidence, they flesh out an argument and bring it to life. Example, see page 526. We can see in this work that Shaw used several examples from a variety of sources. She doesn't only use examples, she also uses facts and statistics, so that she will able to show that apes are capable of using language creatively. Next is citing expert opinion. An expert can contribute to the force of your argument. Of course, we all know that an expert knows a lot of things about his or her field, and many people believe him or her because being an expert means she or he is a professional. Remember that when you will cite an expert opinion, be sure that your expert is related to the field that you're arguing with. For example, you are arguing in favor of mandatory class attendance. You might interview a dean to learn about academic goals that can be accomplished only through class attendance, but you cannot interview policemen or doctors since they are not related to the field. And do not forget to document your sources. You can summary their statements, but be sure to do the MLA form. After supporting your arguments, next is anticipate objections, refute arguments. Readers who already agree with you need no convincing, but different and skeptical readers may resist your arguments because they have their minds of their own. In an argument, you should prove that you are in a position that is more reasonable. To deal with your opposition, you should anticipate their objections as you develop your case paragraph by paragraph. You need to do your best to refute them. Show that your opponent is not as persuasive as they claim because their arguments are flawed, or because your arguments to the contrary have greater weight. Try to establish common grounds with readers who do not agree with you. Show that you share the same value. Example, to persuade people opposed to shooting deer, a state wildlife commission would have to show it too cares about preserving deer and does not want them to die needlessly. As we can see in this example, the commission established values that could persuade the critics that carefully controlled hunting season is good for deer population because it prevents starving due to overpopulation. Remember, you should always show intelligence and decency to persuade the people to change sides, since they believe that intelligence and decency support their side of an argument. Otherwise, they will persist in their opposition. In argumentative writing, you should avoid common mistakes in reasoning. Be alert of common mistakes in inductive and deductive reasoning and to certain mistakes known as logical fallacies. Let's start with using inductive reasoning with care. Inductive reasoning is drawing conclusions from arrays of facts. This reasoning deals with probability, not certainty. Example, your conclusion is the majority of households in our city would subscribe to cable television if it were available. And your evidence is, in a recent survey, 356 of 500 households questioned say they would subscribe to cable television. After drawing conclusion from evidence, you still need to consider such things. First, Is the evidence sufficient? It depends on the population of the city. If the 500 people are 5% sample, of course it is sufficient. But if it is only 1% sample, it will not be sufficient. Second, is the evidence representative? Again, it depends. If the sample had been contracted carefully to reflect age, sex, geographic distribution, and thus not concentrated in one wealthy neighborhood, then it is representative. And lastly, is the evidence relevant? Of course it is. Always remember that your evidence should be relevant to the conclusion that you draw. These questions about your evidence could help you to determine if you have done your inductive reasoning well. Next is using deductive reasoning with care. Deductive reasoning is drawing conclusions from two or more assertions, or also called premises. A premises is a proposition antecedently supposed or proved as a basis of argument. In doing deductive reasoning, you have syllogism. It is the three-step argument construction of the deductive reasoning. Consists of major premise, minor premise, and the conclusion. Here's the example. Anything that increases radiation in the environment is dangerous to the public health. That is our major premise. Next is nuclear reactors increase radiation in the environment, and that is our minor premise. So the third step is, therefore, nuclear reactors are dangerous to public health, which is our conclusion. We can say that the major premise is a generalization and the minor premise is a specific case, while conclusion follows from applying the generalization to the specific case. Deductive arguments break down if one of the premise is not true or the conclusion does not logically follow from them. Example, the deer population in our state should be preserved. During hunting season, hundreds of deer are killed. Therefore, the hunting season should be discontinued. In this example, the major premise is true and also the minor premise, but then the conclusion does not follow them. Due to hundreds of deer killed, it contributes to decrease the overpopulation of deer. So, they might just conclude, therefore, that a limited hunting season helps preserve a healthier and more stable population of deer. Next is avoiding logical fallacies. Logical fallacies are errors such as hasty generalization, non sequitur, false analogy, and so on. Let's start with hasty generalization. Hasty generalization is a conclusion based on insufficient or unrepresentative evidence. Example, deaths from drug overdose in metropolis have doubled in the past 3 years. Therefore, more Americans than ever are dying from drug abuse. This is a hasty generalization because data from one city do not justify a conclusion about the whole United States. Hasty generalizations contains words like all, every, always, and never. But what we should do or what words we should put to the sentence are most, many, usually, and seldom to make it more accurate. One type of hasty generalization is stereotype. It is a generalization about a group. Example is politicians are corrupt. Stereotyping is common because of our human tendency to perceive selectively. We tend to see only what we want to see and fail to notice evidence to the contrary. Example is, if you have concluded that politicians are corrupt, your stereotype will be confirmed by occasional news reports of legislators being indicted. Even though Every day, the papers describe conscientiously officials serving the public honestly and well. Next is non sequitur. A non sequitur, or from the Latin word means does not follow, is a conclusion that does not follow logically from preceding statement or that is based on irrelevant data. Example, Mary loves good food. Therefore, she will be an excellent chef. This is an incorrect conclusion because Mary's love of good food does not guarantee that she will be able to cook it well. Next is false analogy. An analogy points out a similarity between two things that are otherwise dissimilar. In a false analogy, a writer falsely assumes that because two things are alike in one respect, they must be alike in others. Example, if we can put humans to moon, we should be able to find a cure for the common cold. This is an example of false analogy, because putting humans on the moon and finding a cure for common colds are both scientific challenges. But the technical problems confronting medical research are quite different from those solved by space scientists. Next is either-or fallacy. This fallacy is a suggestion that only two alternatives exist when in fact there are more. Example, either learn how to operate a computer or you won't able to get a decent job after college. That is a fallacy because there are many occupations and decent jobs that do not require knowledge of computers. Next is faulty cause and effect reasoning. This is a common fallacy known as post hoc, from Latin meaning after this, therefore because of this, or means first is the cause of the second. Like a non sequitur, it is a leap or an unjustified conclusion. Example, since Governor Smith took office, unemployment of minorities in the state has decreased by 7%. Governor Smith should be applauded for reducing unemployment among minorities. In this example, the writer must show that Governor Smith's policy are responsible for the decrease in employment. It is enough to show merely that decrease followed the governor's taking office. Next is circular reasoning and begging the question. Circular reasoning means no real information have been introduced. By a trick of semantics, you have wound up back there, where you started. Begging questions is a way of ducking the issue. Instead of supporting the conclusion with evidence and logic, the writer simply restates the conclusion in different language. Example, faculty and administration should not be permitted to come to student council meetings because student council meetings should be for students only. In this example, we can see that the writer has given no reason why the faculty and administration cannot be permitted to attend the meeting, but he has merely repeated the point that the meeting is for student council. The word student explains it already. And the last is appeals to emotion. Many arguments we see in the media strive to win our sympathy rather than our intelligent agreement. Like a TV commercial suggesting that you will be thin and sexy if you drink a certain beverage is a making a pitch of emotions. Example of emotional appeals. This progressive proposal build a large ski resort in the state park has been carefully researched by Fidelity. the largest bank in the state. Furthermore, it is favored by a majority of the local merchants. The only opposition comes from narrow-minded, do-gooder environmentalists who care more about trees than they do about people. One of their leaders was actually arrested for disturbing the peace several years ago. In this example, we can see the words such as progressive and do-gooders are biased language. We can also see the ad hominem, or from the Latin word means to the man, by attacking the person who holds a belief, which is the environmentalist, rather than refusing their argument. Another appeal is to transfer. It is associating a prestigious name, which is fidelity, with the writer's side. And another is the bandwagon appeal, which is claiming that an idea should be accepted because a large number of people are in favor, which is the majority of merchants. And last is the red herring, wherein the writer is bringing in irrelevant issues, such as the arrest of the leader for disturbing the peace for several years ago. Fallacies are frequently not so clear-cut that a casual reader can spot them immediately. To recognize such fallacies in your own writing takes discipline, but you can do it if you train yourself to become a skeptical and demanding reader. A skeptical and demanding reader is the kind of person who measures all claims against evidence. That's my report. Thank you.